This man ruled empires and commanded millions. They are responsible for shaping the course of history. But in all their power and fame, their final days were filled with pain, misery, and suffering. When we think of major rulers in history, we like to think that their end was as glamorous as their peak. At least that's what movies and TV shows make us believe. But as much as that is true for some leaders, for most reality hit a little too hard, and their end was so full of agony they could care less about all the power they had acquired in their lifetime. Today we are going to explore the miserable end to some of the greatest rulers to ever exist, from Napoleon to Stalin, from exile to genetic tragedy. This is the darker side of power. If you enjoy dark history, powerful storytelling, and historical documentaries, subscribe for weekly uploads. Number 1. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor in a Cage. At Napoleon's peak, he controlled most of Europe. Kings trembled at his name, and armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands marched under his command. Napoleon was a general worthy of the title, the greatest military commander in history. He even had wars named after him. He was such a great general that his tactics are still being studied in military schools up to this day. But by 1815, it was all over. Napoleon faced defeated at Waterloo by the hands of the British and was sent into exile, not to a palace, nor to a dignified retirement, but to the isolated island of St. Helena. St. Helena was a windswept rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and his prison was a damp, mold-ridden house called Longwood. Here there were no courts, no empire, just British guards watching his every move. The man who once redrew the map of Europe was reduced to obsessing over gardening. Then out of nowhere came the pain, followed by chronic vomiting, sharp abdominal agony, weakness, and finally death, which at that point was a reprieve for him. Most historians believe he died of stomach cancer in 1821, while others suspect slow arsenic poisoning. But one thing is for certain: the Emperor of Europe died arguing with guards in a lonely room, thousands of miles from everything he conquered. Number 2. Joseph Stalin, the silence he created. Stalin was the premier of USSR till his death in 1953. He was a man who has instilled fear in his citizens so much that the mention of his name was enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who wasn't him. He had created a regime ruled by fear, and nobody was exempt. Under his rule, millions were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Even his closest allies feared him. However, in 1953, the most feared man in the Soviet Union collapsed in his private room, and no one dared enter. His own personal guards were terrified of disturbing him without permission, and so they all waited. Hours passed, and when they finally went inside, Stalin was lying on the floor in his own urine, unable to speak, struck by a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Even then, the doctors were a little hesitant, as many of the best physicians had been purged in his earlier political campaigns, so the remaining ones were afraid to act. Later, he was taken to the hospital, and for days, Stalin drifted in and out of consciousness. His inner circle watched, not rushing to save him, and possibly waiting for him to die. The man who built a regime of terror died trapped inside the silence he created. Number 3. Philip II of Spain, the King of Swords. At its height, Philip II ruled over one of the largest empires in history, from Spain to the Philippines and much of the Americas. But in his final months, the empire meant nothing. Gout had crippled him. Fever racked his body. Edema had caused some extreme swelling. He had also developed some malignant sores that covered his body. The stench was so overwhelming that attendants struggled to remain in the room with him. For the last 50 days of his life, he was confined to a specially designed chair and bed. Yet the King of Spain endured it with religious stoicism. In 1598, the ruler of a global empire died slowly, decomposing while still alive. Number 4. George Washington, killed by medicine. George Washington was the first president of the United States and the victorious general of the American Revolution. In December 1799, Washington developed a severe sore throat, likely epiglottitis. In modern day, this is treated with antibiotics, but back then it was something new. So as his breathing became labored, and he struggled to swallow, a worse danger than the illness was slowly closing in. The doctors, following standard medical practice of the time, they performed repeated bloodletting. In less than 24 hours, they had removed nearly 40% of his total blood volume. This made him weaker. Between suffocation and massive blood loss, Washington died in extreme respiratory distress. The father of a nation, bled to death by the best medicine available. 5. Woodrow Wilson, the living ghost. Woodrow Wilson was the president that led America through World War I and envisioned the League of Nations. However, in 1919, Wilson suffered a massive stroke and was paralyzed on his left side. This partially blinded him and altered his personality. And for the last 17 months of his presidency, he was hid from the public. His wife, Edith Wilson, controlled access to him, effectively acting as a gatekeeper to the presidency and running the country in place of his husband. The once powerful orator now sat in a darkened room, prone to emotional breakdowns, unable to fully carry out his duties. He lived several more years, but as a shadow of himself, and power remained in title only. Power is temporary. Armies fade, crowns rust, statues crumble. But in the end, the human body does not care about titles. These rulers controlled continents, but they could not control decay. History remembers their victories, but death remembers no one.